James Hudson's backyard oasis had been the culmination of years of hard work and careful saving. 3 years ago, after receiving a substantial bonus at his engineering firm, he finally pulled the trigger on his dream project. A 32-foot in-ground pool with a custom pebble finish that gave the water a natural Caribbean blue luminescence. Surrounded by ambient lighting, natural stone decking, and lush landscaping that provided both beauty and privacy, it transformed his modest suburban home into a personal resort. The neighbors on Oakwood Lane had been supportive during the 3-month construction process, even as trucks and equipment temporarily disrupted their quiet cul-de-sac. "Property values going up for all of us," Mr. Grayson from across the street had commented with an approving nod. James had hosted a small pool warming party that summer, inviting the immediate neighbors who had endured the construction noise. It had been a perfect day with respectful guests who appreciated his investment. Since then, James had established a routine. Every evening after work, he would change into swim shorts, grab a cold drink from his poolside mini-fridge, and enjoy 30 minutes of peaceful swimming before starting dinner. Weekends were for more elaborate enjoyment, reading on his premium loungers or floating peacefully while listening to jazz through his discreetly installed outdoor speakers. The pool area became his sanctuary, his reward for the pressures of his demanding job designing safety systems. That Wednesday in July had been particularly challenging. A client had rejected a proposal James had spent weeks perfecting, and his boss had asked him to rework the entire project by Friday. Feeling the pressure mounting, James had decided to leave work early for once, hoping an afternoon swim might clear his head and spark some fresh ideas. As he turned onto Oakwood Lane at 2:45 p.m., James immediately noticed something unusual. A bright yellow bike tossed carelessly on his front lawn alongside a pink scooter he'd never seen before. Pulling into his driveway, he could hear splashing and high-pitched squeals coming from his backyard, accompanied by the unmistakable beat of pop music played at full volume. "What the hell?" James muttered, killing the engine and quickly making his way through the side gate he always kept locked. A scene that greeted him stopped him in his tracks. 3 children, none of whom he recognized, were engaged in a boisterous game of pool basketball using his custom non-marking ball and hoop, equipment he meticulously put away after each use. A boy around 12 was performing a cannonball off the side while 2 younger children cheered him on. Colorful pool noodles that didn't belong to James floated abandoned near the steps, and a collection of half-empty juice boxes and open chip bags littered his immaculate stone decking. More shocking than the children was the woman lounging comfortably on his most expensive deck chair, the ergonomic one with memory foam that he'd special ordered from a high-end catalog. She wore oversized designer sunglasses, her blonde highlights arranged in what James suspected was meant to be a casual but was clearly an expensive salon style. One manicured hand held a tall glass of what appeared to be James' own freshly made iced tea, while the other scrolled lazily through her phone. James stood frozen, keys still dangling from his fingers, as he tried to process the invasion of his private space. The woman must have sensed his presence because she glanced up briefly, offering a casual wave as if he was the unexpected visitor, not her. "You must be our new neighbor," she said without fully looking up from her phone, her voice carrying a practiced sweetness that didn't reach her eyes when she finally lowered her sunglasses to examine him. "I'm Karen Thompson. We moved in 3 weeks ago." She gestured vaguely toward the gray colonial next door that had recently sold. "Your pool is a lifesaver in this heat. The kids were going stir-crazy inside." She spoke with such casual entitlement that James momentarily questioned if he had somehow agreed to this arrangement and forgotten. Had a neighborly conversation been misconstrued? Had you made some offhand comment that could have been interpreted as an open invitation? "Tyler, not so close to the deep end," Karen called out to the oldest boy before turning back to James with a conspiratorial smile. "Kids, right? Always trying to test their limits." James found his voice at last. "I'm sorry, but how did you get into my backyard?" The gate was locked. Karen waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, the kids are like little monkeys. Tyler just climbed over and opened it from the inside." She said this as if describing an amusing anecdote rather than trespassing. "I hope you don't mind that I helped myself to some iced tea. It's homemade, isn't it? Just the right amount of sweetness." The first confrontation with Karen had ended uncomfortably. After firmly asking her and the children to leave, James had watched in disbelief as Karen took her time gathering their belongings, acting as if his request was an unexpected inconvenience rather than a reasonable response to trespassing. She'd left with a breezy "see you tomorrow" that had left James wondering if she understood anything he'd said. The following morning, before leaving for work, James double-checked every lock on his property. He secured the gate with a new padlock, made sure his sliding door was locked and the security bar was in place, and even moved his spare key from its hiding spot beneath the decorative rock. As an additional precaution, he left a clearly visible note on the gate: "Private, PROPRT, No trespassing, security cameras in use. The security cameras were a bluff, at least for now. But the note made him feel more secure as he drove to work, hoping the explicit boundary would be enough to deter Karen and her children. That evening, returning home exhausted after staying late to complete his redesigned proposal, James noticed the padlock on his gate hanging open. His heart sank as he hurried to the backyard, only to find it empty, but clearly used. Wet footprints on the decking, a half-eaten popsicle melting on one of his lounge chairs, and his expensive pool vacuum struggling against something caught in its mechanism. Fishing out a child-sized sock from the vacuum, James felt a mix of disbelief and growing anger. Checking his back door, he found it still locked, a small mercy. But then he noticed something else. His hose had been uncoiled and left running near his garden, water pooling uselessly into an already saturated flower bed. The water bill would be his to pay, of course. This wasn't merely inconsiderate, it was deliberate. The broken padlock hadn't been forced. Someone had found his spare key. The next morning, James called in late to work and visited the local electronics store. By noon, he had installed a comprehensive security system. 3 weatherproof cameras with night vision capability strategically positioned to cover his entire backyard, pool area, and the access points to his property. The system uploaded footage to cloud storage and sent real-time alerts to his phone when it detected motion. It was an expense he hadn't planned for, but it felt necessary now. For 2 days, there was no activity. James began to hope that his security measures had sent the message. Then, on Friday afternoon during a critical meeting, his phone buzzed repeatedly with motion alerts. Excusing himself briefly, James checked the footage to see Karen leading not just her 3 children, but 2 additional unknown kids through his gate. She was carrying a cooler and what appeared to be a portable speaker. James texted his neighbor on the other side, Mr. Ramirez, asking him to please check on his property and inform any trespassers that the police would be called if they didn't leave immediately. 20 minutes later, Mr. Ramirez reported back that the backyard was now empty, but that the blonde lady next door seemed really annoyed at being asked to leave. Over the weekend, James reviewed the footage more carefully. What he saw disturbed him deeply. Karen had used a key. Somehow she had either found his spare or made a copy of it before he changed the locks. The children had spent nearly an hour in his pool, playing with his equipment and even using his outdoor shower. Karen had made herself at home, rummaging through his poolside refrigerator, helping herself to his drinks, and at one point, incredibly, answering his doorbell when a package was delivered, signing for it with a casual wave to the delivery person as if she lived there. Most concerning was a moment when the youngest child had slipped on the wet decking, narrowly avoiding a bad fall. Karen had barely looked up from her phone. If the child had been injured, James knew he could have been liable, despite the unauthorized use. The following Wednesday, a new alert came through. This time, James was prepared. He left work immediately, calling his supervisor with a vague family emergency excuse. As he pulled into his driveway, he saw something that made his blood boil. Balloons tied to his back gate and a happy buyer teach yay Tyler banner hung across his patio furniture. Music thumped from a portable speaker and high-pitched squeals of children echoed through the neighborhood. The morning after the birthday party incident, James sat at his kitchen table nursing a cup of coffee and contemplating his next move. The confrontation had left him feeling unsettled and, if he was honest with himself, a little intimidated by Karen's veiled threat. He wasn't one for neighborhood drama. He'd always been the quiet, reliable neighbor who kept to himself and maintained his property meticulously. The idea of being cast as the villain in some suburban power struggle made his stomach churn. Maybe I'm handling this all wrong, he muttered to himself, glancing out the window where he could see the Thompson children already playing in their front yard, occasionally casting glances toward his property. The smallest one pointed at his house and whispered something to his siblings. James had always prided himself on being reasonable. Perhaps direct confrontation wasn't the answer. Perhaps what this situation needed was calm, adult conversation away from impressionable children and judgmental onlookers. After another hour of deliberation, James walked next door and rang the doorbell, a peace offering of sorts in his hand. A gift card to a local coffee shop. When Karen answered, her expression immediately hardened upon seeing him. "I'd like to talk," James said, forcing a neighborly smile. "Perhaps over coffee? My treat." He held up the gift card. "I think we got off on the wrong foot, and I'd like to see if we can work this out like adults." Karen studied him suspiciously before her expression softened into something calculating. "Fine," she agreed, taking the gift card. "Tomorrow morning at 9, the kids will be at summer day camp." The following morning at the coffee shop, James arrived 10 minutes early to gather his thoughts. He prepared what he wanted to say, even rehearsed it in front of his bathroom mirror. He ordered a simple black coffee for himself and waited, watching the door. Karen arrived 15 minutes late, dressed as if for a business meeting rather than a casual coffee. her designer handbag prominently displayed as she ordered the most expensive specialty drink on the menu before sliding into the seat across from him. "I appreciate you agreeing to meet," James began once she was settled. "I think there's been some misunderstanding, and I'd like to clear the air." "I'm listening," Karen said, her tone making it clear she was doing him a favor. James took a deep breath. "I understand that having a pool next door might seem like a convenient amenity, especially with 3 active children during summer break. But I need to make something very clear. My pool and backyard are private property. My homeowner's insurance only covers authorized guests who are there with my explicit permission and supervision." He leaned forward slightly, keeping his tone steady and reasonable. "If one of your children were to be injured while swimming unsupervised in my pool, not only could they be seriously hurt or worse, but I could be held legally and financially responsible. It's what insurance companies call an attractive nuisance. I could lose everything, my home, my savings, in a lawsuit." Karen sipped her drink slowly, watching him over the rim of her cup. When she set it down, she nodded with what appeared to be genuine understanding. "I see your point, James. Legal liability is certainly something to consider." James felt a flutter of hope. Perhaps reason would prevail after all. Karen continued, "So what if we found a way to eliminate that liability issue? Why don't you add us to your insurance policy? I'd be happy to supervise the children at all times." James blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by the suggestion. "That's not how homeowners insurance works. I can't just add neighbors to my policy." "Well then," Karen said, as if offering an even more reasonable compromise, "just give me a key to the gate so we don't have to climb over. I'll sign some sort of waiver absolving you of responsibility if that makes you feel better." The HOA meeting had been worse than James could have imagined. He'd arrived early, hoping to speak with the board president, Marshall Grayson, before things got underway. But Karen had somehow arrived even earlier and was huddled in close conversation with several board members, all of whom gave James cold looks when he entered the community center meeting room. "Let's bring this meeting to order," Marshall announced, avoiding eye contact with James as the room filled with residents. "We have some serious community concerns to address tonight." For the next 45 minutes, James sat in stunned silence as Karen, now presenting herself as a concerned parent and safety advocate, spoke at length about disturbing behaviors she witnessed from certain neighbors who seemed overly interested in watching children. She never named James directly, maintaining plausible deniability while making it abundantly clear who she meant. When James finally had his opportunity to speak, providing documentation of the repeated trespassing, explaining his security cameras, and even showing time-stamped footage of Karen using his outdoor kitchen without permission, the damage had already been done. Several parents interrupted him, asking questions about why he was so obsessed with recording the Thompson children and suggesting his explanation seemed like a cover story. The meeting had ended with Marshall uncomfortably announcing that while no formal HOA rules had been broken, community members should be mindful of how their actions might be perceived. That had been 3 days ago. Since then, James had received anonymous notes in his mailbox suggesting he find another neighborhood and noticed parents pulling their children closer when he checked his mail or took out his trash. The campaign against him was working, and he felt increasingly isolated in the community he'd called home for nearly a decade. Today, his boss had called him into his office first thing in the morning. "James, I need you to attend a client dinner tonight. The Westfield contract is wavering, and they specifically asked for you to walk them through the safety protocols." James had nodded, knowing this was make or break for the company. "Of course. What time?" 7:30 at Mariposa. Black tie, spouses optional. I've already let them know you'll be there." The timing was terrible. James had planned to meet with a security consultant that evening to upgrade his home system after finding his garden hose cut and patio furniture cushions slashed. Anonymous vandalism he strongly suspected was connected to the Thompson situation. But he couldn't refuse. The Westfield contract represented nearly 40% of his department's annual revenue. The dinner went better than expected. The clients responded well to James' detailed explanations and seemed reassured by his expertise. Just after 9, as dessert was being served, James felt his phone vibrate repeatedly in his pocket. He discreetly checked it under the table and saw multiple security alerts from his home system. Excusing himself briefly, he stepped into the restroom's quiet hallway and pulled up the live feed. His stomach dropped. Emergency lights were flashing in his driveway. A police cruiser and an ambulance were parked haphazardly on his lawn. As he watched in horror, paramedics wheeled a small gurney from his backyard, a tiny figure lying motionless on it. The week following the accident was a blur of insurance adjusters, police interviews, and thinly veiled hostility from neighbors who had firmly taken Karen's side. James had been forced to take time off work to deal with the aftermath, which his supervisor had reluctantly approved with a warning about personal issues affecting professional responsibilities. Karen had been surprisingly quiet, No direct confrontations, no trespassing incidents, but James wasn't fooled. His security cameras had captured her in lengthy conversations with neighbors, gesturing toward his property with expressions that alternated between righteous indignation and maternal concern. Her youngest son had returned home from the hospital the day after the incident with a small bandage on his forehead, and Karen had made sure the entire neighborhood witnessed his brave recovery with an impromptu front yard gathering featuring cupcakes and sympathy cards. James' mailbox had yielded 3 separate letters from personal injury attorneys representing the Thompson family, each outlining his negligence and failure to maintain safe premises in language that made his blood pressure spike. His own attorney, a college friend named Michael who specialized in property law, had reviewed the letters with a grim expression. "They're fishing," Michael had explained, "trying to see if you'll panic and offer a settlement. The good news is the police report clearly indicates trespassing. The bad news is..." The attractive nuisance doctrine, James had finished, a term now painfully familiar. Exactly. Swimming pools are specifically mentioned in most case law. Even with security measures, you remain vulnerable. That conversation had solidified the decision James had made that sleepless night. The pool had to go, not just because of Karen and her children, but because it had transformed from a source of joy to a source of anxiety, a liability he could no longer justify. Obtaining quotes for pool removal had been surprisingly straightforward. 3 contractors had visited, each more understanding than the last as James explained his situation. "Happens more than you'd think," the 3rd contractor, a weathered man named Ray, had told him. "Pools become a headache when neighbors start treating them like community property. We filled in 4 last year for similar reasons." Ray's quote had been the most reasonable and his availability immediate. "We had a cancellation. Could start Monday if you want." The timing was perfect. James had been monitoring Karen's social media, a security measure he'd begun taking after the accusation campaign started, and had discovered that the Thompson family was planning a weekend trip to Wildwater Kingdom, an amusement park about 4 hours away. According to Karen's excited posting, they would leave Friday afternoon and return late Sunday. James made his own plans accordingly. He scheduled the pool removal for Friday morning, taking another day off work despite his supervisor's disapproval. He told no one about his decision, not even Mr. Ramirez, who had remained one of his few allies in the neighborhood. This had to be a clean break, a fait accompli that Karen would discover only upon her return. Friday morning arrived with perfect cloudless skies, ideal swimming weather that made James' decision feel momentarily bittersweet. As he stood on his back deck, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise sparkle across the water's surface one last time, he allowed himself a moment of mourning for the peaceful sanctuary his pool had once been. The moment passed quickly when he heard Karen's voice carrying across the fence as she instructed her children on packing for their weekend trip. The familiar sound of her entitled tone strengthened his resolve. Ray's crew arrived precisely at 7:30 a.m., 3 trucks pulling into James' driveway with professional efficiency. By 8 o'clock a.m., the operation was underway. The team worked with impressive cordon. Monday morning dawned bright and clear, the sunlight illuminating James' transformed backyard. The fresh sod looked even better in the morning light, a lush green carpet replacing what had been his pool and deck area. He'd slept better than he had in months, no longer plagued by anxiety dreams about drowning children or crushing lawsuits. James had just finished his 2nd cup of coffee when his security app chimed with a motion alert. Checking the feed, he saw Karen marching along the edge of his property, her designer sunglasses pushed up into her hair as she surveyed the transformation with evident disbelief. Her 3 children darted around her like satellites, pointing and gesturing at the space where the pool had been. "It's going," the oldest boy, Tyler, shouted loud enough for the microphone to pick up. "He stole our pool." James watched as Karen's face cycled through a series of expressions, confusion, disbelief, and then a rapidly mounting fury that turned her complexion an alarming shade of red. She pulled out her phone, apparently taking pictures of the yard, then turned toward his house with clear purpose in her stride. Setting down his coffee mug, James activated the security app's recording function and moved to his front door. He had no intention of hiding or avoiding this confrontation. In fact, he'd been preparing for it since the moment he decided to remove the pool. Through the security feed, he watched Karen storm up to his fence line, hesitate for a moment as if considering whether to cross onto his property, then apparently think better of it. Instead, she marched around to his front yard, her children trailing behind her like a small, angry parade. James opened his front door before she could ring the bell, his own phone held discreetly at his side, recording. "What have you done?" Karen's voice was so shrill that James fought the urge to step back. Her normally perfectly arranged blonde hair was disheveled, perhaps from the weekend trip, lending her an unhinged appearance that matched her tone. "Good morning, Karen," James replied calmly. "I decided to make some changes to my backyard. Is there a problem?" Problem. She was practically vibrating with rage. You destroyed the pool. You knew we used that pool. James maintained his composed demeanor. I removed a pool from my private property, a pool that you and your children were repeatedly told not to use, a pool that you had no permission to access and that recently resulted in your son being injured while trespassing. Karen's eyes narrowed dangerously. Tyler has his birthday pool party here this weekend. I've invited 20 kids. I pay for catering. She thrust her phone toward his face, showing him a digital invitation with his address clearly printed on it, decorative pool graphics framing the text. James blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the sheer audacity. You scheduled a party at my house without asking me. It's not like you used the pool during the day anyway, she snapped as if this justified everything. The kids were counting on it. Do you know how much I spent on pool decorations? On a custom cake shaped like a diving board? The oldest boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. Mom, does this mean we can't have the party? Karen placed a reassuring hand on her son's shoulder without taking her glaring eyes off James. Don't worry, honey. This man is going to fix this. He's going to pay for a replacement party at the country club, aren't you, James? The calm request, delivered as an absolute expectation, nearly made James laugh out loud. Instead, he kept his voice level. Karen, let me be absolutely clear. I am not responsible for parties you plan at my house without my permission. I am not obligated to provide your children with a swimming pool, and I am certainly not going to pay for a replacement venue for a trespassing event I never agreed to host. Karen's expression shifted, the rage momentarily replaced by something calculating. She glanced around, seeming to notice for the first time that several neighbors had emerged from their homes, drawn by her shouting. Mrs. Abernathy across the street was openly watching from her porch. The Wilsons next door had paused their garden work to observe. Even Mr. Ramirez had stepped outside, ostensibly to collect his mail, but clearly interested.